The dog was given the order to attack. But instead, he froze, then whimpered. Under the blistering sun of Sable Ridge, a K9 trained for war ignored every command and pressed his head against the chest of a stranger. A veteran, one the town believed to be dangerous. He didn't move, didn't speak, just stared at the dog as if watching a ghost step out of the dust. And then, in a voice rough and trembling from years of silence, he whispered, "You're not supposed to be here." 5 years earlier, they had both vanished in the fire of Kandahar. But somehow, one of them found the way back, and what happened next would leave the entire town speechless. Before we begin, please subscribe to Healing with Max and share your thoughts in the comments. Tell me, where are you watching from tonight? I truly wonder how far this story will travel. The sun above Sable Ridge burned white as bone, pouring its weight upon the cracked earth until even the shadows seemed to crawl for mercy. Wind hissed through rusted signs, whispering against hollow fuel pumps that hadn't seen life in decades. Paint peeled from the old storefronts, and the horizon shimmered like a mirage caught between memory and ruin. Beneath that molten light, the world felt ancient and listening, as if the desert itself were holding its breath, waiting for one man to move. He sat at the far edge of town, beneath a warped aluminum bus shelter that once promised travelers escape. His posture was upright, military precise, but his spirit bent beneath invisible weight. The desert fatigues he wore were faded but intact, their seams heavy with the dust of too many forgotten roads. The name tag was gone, torn away long ago, but discipline lingered in every breath. Raymond Cole, 55, once a captain in the U.S. Marines, now looked like the kind of man time had chosen not to forgive. His gray eyes, sharp yet hollow, followed the horizon with the quiet patience of someone who'd learned that answers never come quickly. Not out here. All around him, Sable Ridge carried on with its stubborn rhythm. The hum of a ceiling fan inside the diner, the creak of a porch swing moving on its own, the faint smell of old gasoline rising from the ground. It was a town built from sun and silence, where every soul knew every other, and suspicion was easier than kindness. So when a stranger appeared, broad-shouldered, silent, and still, and didn't move for hours, gossip began to scatter through the air like sand in the wind. Some said he was a vagrant. Others whispered that the ex-soldier turned criminal. But across the street, behind the dust-streaked glass of Connolly's hardware and feed, a woman watched him differently. Sarah Connolly had lived most of her 50 years inside those walls. Time had carved her into something lean, steady, and a little brittle at the edges. Her auburn hair, streaked silver, was tied low beneath a faded bandana, and her gait carried the ghost of a limp, a wound from a car crash long ago, one that had taken her firstborn and most of her laughter. She didn't trust me easily anymore, but she loved dogs, and she trusted silence. Silence, she always said, doesn't lie. From behind her counter, she watched the stranger with the slow caution of someone who'd seen too much to take chances. He wasn't begging. He wasn't lost. He was waiting. That was the part that unsettled her. Not his stillness, but his purpose. At 8:41 a.m., she picked up her landline phone, beige, old, the cord twisted like a nervous habit, and called the sheriff's office. "There's a man out by the freight lane," she said. "Been sitting there since dawn. Not moving, not blinking, just watching." She hung up, poured herself coffee, and tried to ignore the unease that crawled beneath her ribs. By 9:05, the sound of tires broke the quiet. A patrol car rolled up, trailing a plume of dust that glimmered in the sun. It stopped a few yards from the shelter. The driver's door opened, and out stepped Deputy Kyle Mercer, 33, broad, sunburned, with the kind of swagger that grows in men who have never been tested by much beyond boredom. His uniform fit too tight, his badge too shiny. He carried authority like a weapon, heavy, but not yet earned. He scanned the stranger, one hand near his sidearm, the other shading his eyes. "Morning," he called out, his tone more warning than greeting. The man didn't respond, just turned his head slightly, slow, deliberate, to acknowledge the deputy. That calmness, that control, scraped against Kyle's nerves like grit in a wound. He didn't like being ignored. "Waiting for a bus, partner?" Kyle asked again, voice sharper now. Still no answer. Only that quiet, steady gaze, level and unreadable. The deputy's pulse kicked. In a place as small as Sable Ridge, silence was an act of defiance. He stepped closer, boots crunching over sand. "You got your ID on you?" The man shifted just enough for his shadow to move across the bench. "Not on me." His voice was low, measured, the kind of voice that belonged to command tents and midnight orders. Calm, but with weight behind it. The deputy didn't like it. I didn't like how it made him feel smaller. He thumbed the radio at his shoulder. "This is Mercer, requesting backup at the freight lane. Possible 1029. The static reply was faint and distorted, swallowed by the desert heat. Across the road, blinds tilted, silhouettes filled windows. The town was watching now. They always watched when something cracked the monotony. Inside her shop, Sarah leaned on the counter, her coffee cooling in her hands. Through the glare, the man's figure looked blurred, almost ghostly. She thought of her husband's last night home before deployment, how he'd sat on the porch in silence, staring into nothing, as if already halfway gone. That same stillness now sat beneath the bus shelter, not of menace, but of mourning. By 9:20 the air shimmered so fiercely that the street seemed to waver, as if the whole town were melting into memory. Even the vultures circled higher, unwilling to touch the suffocating air. Kyle shifted, uncomfortable, his hand never leaving his belt. He wasn't sure if he was confronting danger or loneliness made flesh. Then, faint but growing, came another sound, a low hum, deep and certain, cutting through the heat. The kind of sound that didn't belong to locals, a second vehicle. Kyle turned, eyes narrowing toward the curve of the road. Dust rose there, golden and alive, spinning up from the horizon. The radio crackled again, and a clipped voice came through. "Tactical K9 unit inbound for assistance. ETA is 3 minutes. The deputy frowned. Backup? For one unarmed man sitting in the sun, it didn't make sense. But rules were rules, and procedure was gospel in small towns where power meant routine. He adjusted his stance, glanced again at the silent figure, still motionless. The notebook on the man's knee caught a flicker of light, leather-bound, edges worn, as if it had traveled farther than most men ever would. The silence stretched between them like wire. Kyle's shirt clung to his back, sweat trickling under his collar. He didn't like the way the man watched without looking, the way the air felt charged, as though something was waiting to break. Inside the diner across the street, 10-year-old Finn Bradford pressed his nose to the window. A freckled boy with grass-stained jeans and eyes too curious for his own good. He watched the patrol car and the stranger with rapt fascination. His mother called him from the kitchen, but he didn't move. His grandfather used to tell him stories about soldiers and their dogs. the kind that saved lives halfway across the world. For reasons he couldn't explain, something about that man's posture reminded him of those stories, of soldiers who looked both strong and lost at the same time. A dry wind swept through the street, carrying the smell of creosote and rust. Beyond the freight lane, the glint of sunlight caught the windshield of a dark SUV. It approached slowly, purposefully, the desert parting before it. The red and blue of its light bar flickered faintly through the haze. Kyle's stomach tightened. He wiped sweat from his brow, forcing a smirk he didn't feel, the kind that men use when they want to look brave. The SUV rolled closer, its tires whispering against sand. The town seemed to hold its breath. The deputy read the logo as it came into view. Bold letters against white steel, K9 Tactical Response. He muttered under his breath, voice low and dry as the wind. Let's see if the dog can make him talk. The patrol SUV rolled to a stop, stirring up a slow spiral of dust that shimmered like broken glass beneath the late morning sun. Heat bent the air, making the edges of everything tremble. The cracked storefronts, the rusted mailbox, the still figure beneath the warped aluminum shelter. The town seemed to hold its breath as the rear door of the vehicle swung open with a hydraulic hiss. Out leapt a German shepherd, his paws hitting the sand with soft authority. His coat was a deep sable and black, sleek yet weathered, his frame powerful but precise, moving like a living shadow trained to obey the smallest shift of breath. His handler, Officer Tanya Gleason, followed close behind, her boots crunching against the gravel, her stance squared and alert. Tanya was in her early 30s, athletic and composed, her sharp features set beneath the brim of her regulation cap. Dark curls escaped from the bun at the back of her neck, catching faint streaks of sunlight. The heat didn't seem to touch her. Years in Phoenix had taught her to wear discomfort like armor. Her eyes, a cool gray blue, flicked from the stranger to her partner, gauging tension like a tuning fork. "Axel," she commanded, voice crisp, firm, without hesitation. The shepherd froze mid-step, ears forward, tail low, body coiled. Across the street, townsfolk peered through windows and doorframes, faces pale in the glare, curiosity mixing with unease. Even Sarah Connolly stepped out onto the porch of her shop, her limp barely noticeable, hand shading her eyes. The air was thick enough to drink. Raymond Cole didn't move. Not when the deputy shifted his grip near the holster. Not when Tanya called another order. His expression was still, calm in a way that unnerved everyone. The German shepherd advanced a step, sand whispering beneath his paws, his amber eyes locked onto Raymond's face, studying it with unnatural focus. Tanya's hand hovered near the leash clip, ready to release. But then something small, invisible to the onlookers, changed. The dog's muscles stiffened, not from aggression, but from something else entirely. Recognition. His ears twitched, his gaze softened. A low sound escaped him, fragile and uncertain, like a memory trying to speak after too long in silence. Tanya blinked, uncertain she'd heard it right. "Axel," she repeated, firmer now. The dog didn't respond. His breathing slowed, tail lowering even more. He tilted his head slightly, eyes never leaving the man before him. Raymond's hand twitched once, barely perceptible, as though some instinct old as war told him to reach out. Not in defense, but in remembrance. A murmur rippled through the small crowd. "Why is he not biting?" someone whispered. The question seemed to hang in the heat like the hum of an insect. Tanya's pulse quickened. K9s didn't hesitate. Not trained ones. Not him. Her voice tightened. Axel! Bite! The word cracked through the stillness like a whip, but what followed was not an attack. The dog froze, quivering. His mouth didn't open, his teeth didn't flash. Instead, a soft, broken whimper left his throat, a sound that didn't belong to an instrument of law or war. The murmurs died instantly, every eye in Sable Ridge fixed on the strange tableau, a soldier who wouldn't move, and a dog who refused to obey. The German shepherd took another step forward, trembling. Then, slowly, he pressed his forehead against Raymond's chest. The contact was delicate at first, uncertain, like a question waiting for an answer. Raymond's shoulders tensed, then sagged. His hand came up, hovering for a heartbeat before resting gently on the dog's neck. Dust clung to his fingers, mingling with the fur, and his breath caught like a man remembering the sound of his own name after years of silence. No one spoke. Even Deputy Kyle's hand fell away from his gun. Tanya's lips parted, confusion and disbelief warring across her face. Axel, she murmured again, but her voice trembled now, cracking under something she couldn't name. The tag on the dog's collar glinted in the sunlight, a battered military tag, edges worn smooth by time and movement. It caught the wind, swinging once, twice before the letters caught the light. Max. The name hit Raymond like the sun itself, blinding, searing, undeniable. His jaw tightened, his breath faltered. For the first time since dawn, his expression broke. At that moment, the distance between man and dog vanished. All that remained was recognition, old as loyalty itself. His hand slipped behind Max's ears, and the shepherd whimpered again, pressing closer, trembling with something deeper than fear. Raymond's lips parted. The words barely made it past his throat, fragile as a prayer whispered to no one. "You're not supposed to be here," he said. His voice carried the weight of loss, of years buried beneath silence and sand. Tanya blinked, uncertain she'd heard him right. "What did he just say?" the lieutenant beside her asked under his breath. She didn't answer. The desert around them had gone utterly still, even the wind pausing in its long journey across the dunes. Behind them, Sarah took a step forward without realizing it. Something in her chest ached at the sight. The way the man knelt, the way the dog leaned in, trembling as if afraid to wake from a dream. The scene didn't look like a reunion. It looked like a resurrection. Deputy Kyle lowered his radio, his voice dry. "That dog was trained to kill," he muttered. "Why's he—" He didn't finish the thought. No one could. Tanya crouched slightly, confusion tightening every line of her body. She scanned the tag again, reading the letters as if they might change. Max. The name was unfamiliar to her unit. Her dog's file read Axel Tactical Reissued. There was no mention of a prior handler, no service record linking him to this stranger, and yet the bond unfolding before her eyes defied every rule she knew. Raymond's fingers brushed against the old tag, feeling the faint etching beneath the dirt. He exhaled, the sound breaking something open inside him. Max licked his hand once, a slow, deliberate gesture that made Tanya's throat tighten. "Axel," she whispered again, more softly now, uncertain of the name she should use. The dog flicked one ear but didn't move. His loyalty had already chosen its side. The crowd remained frozen, a small desert town suspended between disbelief and reverence. Even the boy, Finn, stood motionless near the diner door, lemonade cup trembling in his grip. His mother's hand rested on his shoulder, but he didn't feel it. He only saw the man and the dog, and something deep in his young heart understood. This was not danger. It was destiny remembering its way home. The sun pressed harder, burning white against the tin roofs. The smell of dust and rusted metal filled the air. Raymond leaned closer, whispering something too soft to hear, and Max responded with a low rumble that wasn't a growl, but a sigh, as if some piece of him, long thought dead, had just exhaled again. At last, Tanya straightened, eyes wide, her voice a thin thread of disbelief. She leaned toward the lieutenant beside her and whispered, "What did he just call the dog?" The wind answered before he could. A gust rolled through the empty street, carrying the sound of the name still echoing between them. Max. For a long moment, nobody breathed. Even the desert wind, that eternal wanderer, seemed to stop and listen. Heat shimmered above the asphalt like a fevered dream, bending the air between man and dog. The silence was not empty. It was heavy, brimming with disbelief, awe, and something like grief rediscovered. Then, from the static of a police radio, a sharp beep cut through the stillness, bright and cold as steel. Tanya's hand trembled as she lifted the scanner from her belt. Her thumb hovered before she pressed the button, and a small green light blinked to life. The sound it made, the measured chirp of a microchip scan, was ordinary, mechanical, and yet, in that instant, it felt like the ticking of fate itself. The device hummed once, then displayed a line of text across the screen. Tanya's eyes widened, her lips parted, whispering the words she could scarcely believe. Designation, K9 Max, missing in action, Kandahar 2018. A ripple of sound moved through the crowd, a collective intake of breath, a murmur like wind stirring dry leaves. The deputy swore softly, the word dying in the dust. For 5 years, that name had been a story told in passing, a legend from a war most wanted to forget. And now, in this forgotten town, the ghost had returned, not as a myth, but as flesh and fur. Raymond knelt slowly, movements deliberate, as if afraid that one sudden gesture might break the spell. His knees pressed into the hot sand. His hand hovered above Max's head, fingers shaking, then sinking into the thick sable fur that carried the scent of heat and earth. The shepherd sighed, a sound so familiar, so heartbreakingly human, that Raymond's throat closed. The years collapsed inside him, and for one impossible heartbeat, Kandahar came rushing back. The firelight, the roar of gunfire, the sound of Max's bark cutting through the smoke. Someone in the crowd whispered, "My God, it's real." From the diner window, little Finn Bradford pressed his face against the glass, eyes wide with a wonder that adults had long forgotten how to feel. He couldn't be more than 9, all knees and elbows, freckles and sunlight, with hair that caught the gold of the morning. He'd grown up listening to his grandfather's old Marine stories, tales of the captain and his dog who saved a convoy out in a place called Kandahar. He used to draw pictures of them, a soldier with a scar on his face, a dog with eyes that glowed like embers. Now, the story stood alive before him, and he didn't blink for fear it might fade back into legend. But not everyone was lost in awe. Near the patrol car, Lieutenant Ray Hollis, the acting sheriff, stepped forward. He was a thick man in his late 50s, skin reddened from years of desert sun, gray hair slicked back, and a belly pressed against the edge of his belt. His face bore the permanent squint of authority unaccustomed to being questioned. The situation, this spectacle of silence and sentiment, did not sit well with him. "That dog," he barked, voice grating through the tension, "is federal property. And this man?" His finger stabbed the air toward Raymond. "He's trespassing." The words shattered the fragile peace like a bottle thrown at a wall. The crowd stirred uneasily, shifting between sides they didn't understand. Tanya lowered the scanner, her jaw tight. "Sir," she began cautiously, "this isn't—" But Hollis cut her off, puffed with pride and heat. "I said secure the animal." Max tensed instinctively, pressing closer to Raymond, a low growl rumbling deep in his chest. The sound wasn't menacing, it was protective, ancient. Raymond's hand rested against the dog's neck, his tone calm but steady. "Easy, boy." Across the street, Sarah Connolly folded her arms, the wind catching the loose strands of her hair. She watched with narrowed eyes, her heart pounding with something she couldn't name. Anger, fear, perhaps recognition of her own old wounds. Every soul in Sable Ridge could feel the air turning electric, like a storm that hadn't yet shown itself. Then came the distant hum of another engine, lower, smoother, too clean for this dusty town. All eyes turned toward the far road as a dark SUV glided into view, sunlight flashing off its polished surface. The vehicle rolled to a stop beside the patrol car, tires crunching softly over the gravel. Its government plates gleamed beneath the fading sun. The door opened, and out stepped a man whose presence seemed to drain the color from the day. Lieutenant Commander Maynard Cross, mid-40s, tall, narrow-shouldered, dressed in a perfectly pressed desert suit the color of sand. His hair was steel gray, cut short in regulation style, and his expression was unreadable, the kind carved from habit, not emotion. Even his movements carried precision, like each step was measured against an invisible rule. He glanced once at the sheriff, then at Tanya, and finally at Raymond. When he spoke, his voice was low but carried the authority of someone long accustomed to obedience. "You've just detained a federal operative," he said coldly. The sheriff blinked, his bluster faltering. What?" he stammered. "A federal operative," Maynard repeated, removing a slim envelope from his inner pocket. "This man," he gestured toward Raymond without looking at him, "was not supposed to be located. This unit," his eyes flicked to Max, "was not supposed to be active." The crowd murmured again, unease spreading like wildfire. Finn's mother pulled him away from the window, whispering something he didn't hear. Sarah's gaze locked on Maynard, sensing the type. The man who spoke in orders and left others to clean up their echoes. Tanya stepped closer, voice tight. "Sir, with respect, this dog—" "This operative," Maynard interrupted, "was declared missing in action. You have no jurisdiction here, Officer Gleason." The weight in his tone left no room for argument. The sheriff swallowed hard, looking between them, then at Raymond, whose silence was somehow louder than all of it. Raymond remained on one knee beside Max, one hand resting on the dog's neck. He didn't look at Maynard. He didn't need to. The way his jaw tightened said everything: recognition, anger, regret. Tanya's scanner slipped from her grip, landing softly in the dust. The small green light still blinked, steady and indifferent, like the heartbeat of a truth no one could unsee. Maynard turned fully toward Raymond now, his shadow stretching long across the ground. The sunlight caught in his pale eyes, turning them the color of dry bone. His voice dropped, quieter, almost intimate. "You've compromised the mission," he said. A pause. The air grew heavier. "And now," he continued, "you've woken ghosts that should have stayed buried." The wind picked up again then, sharp, stinging, alive, and the desert, as if it understood, swallowed the sound whole. The sun had begun its slow descent, washing the desert in hues of bruised gold and fading flame. The air trembled as the heat started to die, leaving behind a hush that was almost tender, the kind of silence that comes after confession. In the distance, the government SUV gleamed like a black scar against the light, its engine still idling, the faint hum cutting through the whisper of wind and grit. Inside, Lieutenant Commander Maynard Cross spoke in clipped tones, words encrypted and sharp. "Echo Team, confirm asset retrieval, ETA 12 minutes. The static answered with its own ghostly rhythm, a cold reminder that some orders were given without mercy. Across the road, the world was smaller, more human. Tanya Gleason knelt beside Max, one hand steadying his collar, the other tracing the faint scar beneath his jaw. It was a clean line, healed long ago, but telling a story that no report ever would. "He never forgot you," she murmured, her voice almost lost to the wind. Max leaned into her touch, eyes half-lidded, the rise and fall of his chest slow and certain. Raymond stood nearby, silent as ever, his shadow long and thin against the cooling sand. For the first time in years, the hardness in his eyes had cracked, revealing something softer beneath. Not weakness, but release. The town seemed to watch from the periphery. People leaning against door frames, heads tilted, voices low. Curiosity had turned into reverence, suspicion into something gentler. And yet, no one dared step closer, except one. Sarah Connolly locked the door of her hardware store, pocketed the key, and crossed the street. The limp in her gait caught the dying light, giving her movement a rhythm of endurance rather than frailty. She stopped beside Raymond, her gaze fixed on Max. "He dragged you out, didn't he?" she said quietly, her voice rough from years of dust and grief. Raymond looked at her, and something passed between them, a shared understanding born of loss. He nodded once, the motion small but certain. "He saved me," he said, his voice gravel and truth. "And they told me he didn't make it." Sarah's lips parted as if to speak, but she didn't. Instead, she looked down at the shepherd, at the faint tremor in his flank, the way his ear twitched toward Raymond's breathing, and she smiled through the ache that memory left behind. "Sometimes," she whispered, almost to herself, "they tell us that to make us move on." The desert wind shifted, carrying her words away before they could settle. Down the road, the metallic rattle of a cane announced the arrival of another figure. Clary Henshaw, an elderly veteran who lived 2 towns over, made his slow approach. He was in his late 70s, lean and weathered, with skin like leather and eyes clouded by both years and knowledge. His jacket, patched with faded insignia, fluttered against his frame as he stopped near the group. His hand gripped the cane carved from old hickory, the head of it worn smooth from decades of use. "That dog," he rasped, nodding toward Max. "He's got old-school training. You see that pause before he moves? He's checking for landmines." The words struck like quiet thunder. Heads turned. Tanya blinked, looking again at the shepherd, now still, nostrils twitching faintly as if mapping invisible terrain. Even Maynard, inside his car, paused mid-sentence. Clary continued, voice steady, voice of one who had seen too many ghosts walk the earth. "They don't teach that anymore. Those dogs, they learned to think before they leapt." For a moment, the town forgot the hierarchy of command. The badge, the uniform, the title, all dissolved into the dust. All that remained was the truth of one soldier's memory and one dog's devotion that time had failed to bury. Raymond knelt again, his hand resting on Max's shoulder. "He always did that," he said softly. "Even when the shooting started, he'd wait. Make sure the path is safe for me. His throat worked around the words. I thought I was protecting him. He smiled then, faint and sorrowful. Turns out he was protecting me. The sun slipped lower, bleeding orange into the sand like spilled oil. Shadows grew longer, and the smell of cooling earth filled the air. Tanya rose to her feet, her eyes glassy but unashamed. She didn't salute, but she nodded, the kind of gesture that meant respect, not regulation. The illusion of peace held for a breath, then cracked. The door of the SUV swung open with mechanical precision, and Maynard stepped out, phone in hand, his expression carved from stone. Command confirmed, he said, voice raised just enough to reach them. Max and Cole are both being extracted. The chopper's on its way. A low murmur rippled through the crowd. Fear, disbelief, protest. No one knew which. Sarah's hand went to her mouth. Tanya's shoulders stiffened. Raymond didn't move. Max looked up at him, as if sensing what the words meant, separation once again, after only minutes of reunion. The old veteran, Clary, tapped his cane once against the ground. You're making a mistake, he said, his tone thin but firm. You take them apart, you'll break what's left. Maynard didn't answer. His eyes flicked to the horizon, already tinted crimson. He listened for something only he could hear, the faint rhythmic beat of rotor blades cutting through the upper air. The noise grew slowly, like a heart waking from long sleep. The town fell silent once more. Even the cicadas seemed to stop. The orange light deepened to rust, and the desert began to glow with the strange beauty that comes just before darkness. In the reflection of the diner's window, young Finn Bradford stood frozen again, his cracked tablet held tight in his small hands. The screen glowed faintly, casting a soft blue light on his face. A video played, shaky, grainy, filmed by someone from the crowd. The thumbnail bore a title written in hurried text, The K9 Who Remembered His Soldier. The sound of rotor blades thickened, rolling across the sand like thunder without rain. And in that moment, between the rising wind and the oncoming noise, the story of Raymond and Max had already left Sable Ridge, spreading far beyond the desert that tried to bury it. By the time the sun sank behind the ridge, the world had already found them. What began as a shaky clip filmed on a cracked tablet had spread faster than wind over dry brush. Across the country, screens glowed with the same impossible image: a German shepherd refusing an attack order, pressing his head into the chest of a battle-worn veteran. They called it the Desert Miracle. Within hours, hashtags rose like prayers carried by invisible hands. On phones and televisions, people whispered, "That dog remembered." In hospital corridors, nurses paused mid-shift, watching with trembling smiles. At an airport gate, a soldier returning home stood frozen, hand pressed to his heart as the footage replayed again and again. A schoolteacher in Montana wept quietly over her lunchbox, while a bus driver in Phoenix slowed to a stop, tears glinting against the steering wheel. In a small church in Kansas, an old woman looked up at the flickering light on the altar and whispered, "Thank you, Lord. They still remember." The world didn't just watch, it prayed. And in the quiet spaces between those prayers, something in humanity exhaled. Inside his vehicle, Lieutenant Commander Maynard Cross stared at the encrypted tablet on his dashboard. Notifications cascaded like rain on metal, codes, authorizations, containment orders. He had seen many missions unravel, but never like this. What had begun as a classified retrieval had turned into a living broadcast. The world was no longer his audience. It was his judge. His reflection in the windshield looked older than he remembered, more brittle, less certain. Outside, the desert glowed with dying light. Inside, his orders bled into noise. He looked at Raymond Cole, standing tall despite the heat and exhaustion, and said in a voice that carried both command and disbelief, "You understand what this means. He's not an asset anymore. He's a symbol." Raymond didn't answer. He didn't need to. His silence was a language the battlefield had carved into him long ago. Beside him, Max stood still, amber eyes fixed on the horizon, fur catching the last traces of gold as the wind lifted dust between them. The shepherd's calm wasn't obedience, it was knowing. Raymond rested a hand lightly on his neck, and in that simple gesture, years of silence folded into forgiveness. The town began to gather again, not in chaos, but in reverence. Sarah Connolly emerged first, locking the door of her hardware shop, her limp more pronounced now, but her pace deliberate. Behind her came Officer Tanya Gleason, her regulation posture softened, eyes rimmed red from more than sand. Little Finn Bradford clutched his tablet close, as if afraid the world might snatch it away. And last came Clary Henshaw, the old veteran, cane in hand, boots dragging softly across the gravel, face tilted toward the sky as if measuring the weight of what was about to happen. They stood in a circle around Raymond and Max. Not armed, not defiant, simply there. The kind of presence that says, "We see you, and we won't let the world forget." Even Sheriff Hollis, who had once barked suspicion, removed his hat and bowed his head. His pride had burned away in the same sun that lit the ridge. For a moment, hierarchy dissolved. The desert had no ranks, only witnesses. Maynard exhaled hard, the sound half sigh, half surrender. The file folder in his hand fluttered in the wind like a flag losing meaning. "Protocol says we will take him back," he said at last. His words were flat, mechanical, but his tone cracked around the edges. A man repeating rules he no longer believed in. Silence followed, thick as heat. Then came Clary's voice, rough, deliberate, each word striking like gravel underfoot. Protocol never met a dog who remembered mercy. The words cut through the desert air with the gravity of scripture. Every head turned toward him. Tanya's breath caught. Sarah looked down, blinking away tears that glimmered like tiny mirrors of sunset. Even Finn, too young to understand the depth of it, knew something sacred had just been spoken. Maynard's gaze lingered on the old veteran. The man's cane trembled slightly in his grip, but his eyes, pale and steady, didn't waver. For the first time, Maynard felt the thin divide between obedience and humanity. He looked down at Max, whose quiet presence seemed to bend the world around him. He had seen soldiers disobey before, but never like this. Never in the name of love. He turned to Raymond, studying the man whose silence carried more conviction than a courtroom's verdict. Raymond's posture hadn't changed. Shoulders squared, jaw firm, hand still resting on Max's fur. For years, Maynard had lived by procedure. Yet now, staring at these two survivors, one man, one animal, both scarred and steadfast, the protocol in his hands felt like dust. Slowly, deliberately, Maynard lowered the folder. The wind caught the edges, fluttering the papers as if they too wanted to leave this place. "Then let it be known," he said softly, his voice trembling into conviction, "that today we serve something higher than rules." The words hung in the air like a prayer spoken at the end of a long war. The crowd didn't cheer. They didn't move. They simply stood, as if the earth itself demanded stillness in honor of what had just been said. From the diner doorway, June Bradford, Finn's mother, stepped out, wiping her hands on her apron. She stopped beside her son, one arm protectively around his shoulders. Finn looked up at her, eyes wide. "Are they heroes, Mama?" he asked. June didn't answer right away. She looked at Raymond and Max, framed by the copper glow of the setting sun, then whispered, "Yes, baby, the kind that don't ask to be." The sky deepened to rust and rose. A new sound rolled over the horizon, low, rhythmic, gathering power. The ground trembled beneath their feet as the first gust of wind swept through the street. The Black Hawk appeared beyond the ridge, its rotors slicing through the air like thunder without rain. Sand spiraled upward in golden clouds, whipping through hair and fabric, stinging eyes and lips, but this time, no one ran. No one ducked for cover. The people of Sable Ridge stood shoulder to shoulder, Sarah with her limp, Tanya with her trembling hands, Clary with his cane planted firm in the dirt, Finn clutching his mother's hand, and Raymond with Max standing solid at his side. The wind howled around them, but they did not move. They were not resisting power. They were bearing witness to grace. Raymond lifted his face to the wind. Max stayed pressed against his leg, calm and unafraid. The downwash turned the air into chaos. Grit, heat, light. But within it, there was peace. Maynard stepped back, eyes narrowed against the sand, and for a fleeting second he smiled. A weary, wordless smile that said more than apology. "I understand." The helicopter roared overhead, circling once before descending. Its blades churned the dust into halos around the figures below. Yet in that storm of light and motion, the line between command and compassion had already vanished. The world would call it a miracle. The people of Sable Ridge would call it memory. But for Raymond Cole and Max, the man and the dog who found each other again in the desert's silence, it was simply home. The wind howled as the helicopter descended, beating the air into spirals of gold and grit. Dust rose in curling waves that danced against the dying light, coating every face, every roof, every quiet watcher of Sable Ridge. The town had fallen utterly still, the kind of silence that doesn't ask for reverence, but receives it all the same. The downwash bent the mesquite trees, rattled old tin signs, and lifted prayer into motion. Through it all, Raymond Cole stood unshaken beside his dog, the brassy reflection of the helicopter's belly washing over his weathered face. When the Black Hawk's wheels touched the sand, Raymond lowered himself to one knee beside Max, his movements deliberate, reverent, as if afraid the act might break the spell that bound them. The shepherd's fur rippled under the wind, shades of sable and dust, soft where war had not scarred it. Raymond reached into his chest pocket and pulled out a patch, frayed and sun-bleached, its threadbare edges barely holding together the faded letters. VLR 29. His fingers trembled as he pinned it gently to Max's collar. The noise around them faded into something hollow, distant, the kind of silence that lives between heartbeats. "I never forgot you," Raymond whispered, his voice almost lost to the roar of the blades. His hand lingered on the dog's neck, the familiar warmth grounding him in a world that had shifted too many times to count. Max leaned closer, tail low, eyes steady and clear. No hesitation, no fear. Just that old, unspoken trust, born in a place too far away to name and too sacred to explain. A soft chuckle broke through the noise. From across the street, Marshal Greg Tuller, broad-shouldered mid-50s, his shirt sleeves rolled up against the heat, approached with a small lunchbox in his hand. Dust streaked his glasses, and the lines around his eyes were carved by years of long drives and longer regrets. "Figured the dog wasn't the only one hungry," he said, voice half swallowed by the wind. A faint smile tugged at his lips, the kind that comes from men who have seen enough sorrow to recognize peace when it finally appears. Raymond looked up, the corners of his mouth lifting in return. There was something in his eyes that hadn't been there for years. Not relief, not victory, but a quiet release. "Appreciate it," he said simply, taking the box. The smell of roast beef and rye mingled with the dry air, faint but grounding, pulling the moment down from heaven to earth. Greg nodded once and stepped back, giving space where words could not go. Behind them, the townsfolk gathered once more, the same faces now half hidden behind scarves and raised arms. Sarah Connolly stood with her hand on the frame of her closed shop door, her expression soft yet proud. Tanya Gleason lingered near her patrol SUV, one hand shielding her eyes, the other unconsciously gripping the chew toy she used to train Max, the one embroidered with the word, Faith. She didn't try to call him back. She just watched. Clary Henshaw, the old veteran, leaned heavy on his cane, eyes narrowed against the grit, jaw set firm, and beside him, little Finn Bradford clung to his mother's hand, the glow of his tablet still flickering faintly against his chest. The wind turned colder as the light began to fade. Raymond rose, brushing sand from his fatigues. He looked once more at Max, who met his gaze without flinching. In that exchange was everything that couldn't be said. The memory of fire, the years of absence, the unspoken truth that some souls never really part. Then, through the storm of dust and sound, came the small, determined voice of a child. "I'll take care of the bench." Finn had broken free from his mother's grasp and was running through the haze, his little boots kicking up trails of sand. His voice wavered against the roar of the helicopter, but his conviction didn't. "So you'll have somewhere to come back to," he shouted again, cheeks flushed, eyes shining. Raymond froze mid-step, his hand still on Max's collar. For a long moment he said nothing. Then he smiled, that quiet, forgiving kind of smile that belongs to men who have finally made peace with the past. He raised one hand to his temple in salute, then pointed toward the boy. "You take care of it, soldier," he called, and Finn nodded fiercely, as if given the most important mission in the world. The helicopter's blades thundered louder now, churning the air into a storm. Maynard stood near the edge of the landing zone, one hand pressed against his headset, the other shielding his face from the sand. His expression was unreadable, but the file under his arm remained closed. He didn't issue another order. Not this time. Raymond climbed aboard, Max following close beside him, the dog's movement smooth and certain despite the turbulence. Inside, the cabin was dimly lit, vibrating with the pulse of the engine. Raymond settled onto the bench, and Max rested his head on his knee. Their shadows stretched across the metal floor. Two silhouettes, side by side, framed by dust and light. Outside, the townsfolk stood their ground as the Black Hawk lifted. The downdraft whipped their hair and clothes, sending grit into their eyes. But none of them looked away. They shielded their faces not from the sand, but from the weight of feeling that pressed too hard to bear. Sarah's lips moved soundlessly. A prayer or maybe just a thank you. Tanya's eyes shimmered. Clary held his hat to his chest, and little Finn, covered in dust, still stood at the foot of the old bus shelter, his small hand raised in farewell. The helicopter rose higher, turning the town into a constellation of lights and memory beneath the settling haze. The sound grew distant, replaced by the whisper of wind and the faint rustle of sagebrush bending in reverence. The sun slipped fully beneath the horizon, leaving behind a glow that felt less like fire and more like mercy. Weeks later, when the sand had finally settled and the rumor had faded into legend, a new thing appeared at the bus stop. It was small, a bronze plaque fastened to the weathered bench where it all began. The engraving caught the morning light in letters simple but sure. To those who serve and those who wait, seen or unseen, welcome home. No one claimed to have made it, though the townsfolk said Sarah paid the smith, and Finn helped polish it after school. Some mornings, Tanya would stop there before her shift, tracing her fingers over the word home. Clary would sit nearby, Kane resting on his knees, watching the sunrise without speaking. And sometimes, when the desert wind moved just right, when the sky burned that same molten gold as the day they left, people swore they could hear it. The low thrum of distant blades and the echo of a dog's soft bark carried through the sage and sand. They said the sound didn't bring sorrow. It brought peace. Because some stories, once spoken into the world, never end. They just keep circling above us like guardians, reminding us that mercy, once found, doesn't die. And out there, in the vast quiet of Sable Ridge, the legend of Raymond Cole and Max lived on. Not as a tale of war, but of grace that outlasted it. Perhaps what Raymond and Max taught us is simple, that mercy can survive the fire, and kindness can outlast the noise. That in a world that moves too fast to feel, there are still hearts willing to wait. And forgive there are stories we tell because they heal something in us. Stories about loyalty that never asks for reward, courage that doesn't shout, and mercy that survives the dust. Maybe that's what this one was. Not about battles or medals, but about the quiet kind of love that outlives war. Somewhere out there, a man still walks with the memory of a dog who waited. Somewhere, a light still burns for those who served and those who never stopped believing. And if you listen, really listen, you might hear it too. A soft breath, a heartbeat beneath the wind. A reminder that kindness doesn't need witnesses to be real. Because not all guardians wear uniforms. Some just stand beside us unseen until the world feels safe enough to rest. If this story touched you, stay with us. Subscribe, and let your heart find the next story waiting to be heard. One of hope, healing, and the quiet heroes who still walk among us.